So I'm just going to go ahead and get started. I'll just quickly introduce myself. My name is Monique Tallon. I'm the CEO of Highest Path Global. We are a boutique global diversity and inclusion consulting firm where we focus on building female leaders and closing the gender gap within organizations. And we've partnered with companies like Microsoft and Siemens and Farmers Insurance and a whole bunch of other companies who are really dedicated to building inclusive cultures. And it's been a real honor for me to be able to work with some fabulous women and men who are really dedicated to supporting women and seeing them advance, especially in the tech field. So in just a second, I'll do a little bit of background on myself, but I just want to thank everyone for joining me today. I am going to just kind of jump in because we don't have a ton of time for today's session. And hopefully you will be able to see my slides as I advance them. So I'm just going to go ahead and jump in and look at what our objectives are for today. So today I really want to talk about one of the big leadership challenges that women face in the workplace, especially in tech. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about how that translates into a leadership tightrope that can sometimes limit women's advancement in their careers. And I'm going to actually share with you, give you an overview of something that I've developed called the Feminine Leadership Model, which is a central theme in my book called Leading Gracefully. And so for those of you who are interested in this topic and in some of the points that I talk about today, you can learn a lot more in my book where sort of more detail. But today will be sort of an overview, and I want to share with you how you can actually apply some of the pieces of the feminine leadership model in your everyday, day-to-day workplace, in your leadership style, and how you manage your teams. So that's just a quick brief overview of what we're going to cover today. So to just tell you a little bit about myself, when I was in my mid-20s, I worked in Silicon Valley at a little company called eBay. You might have heard of them. That's me when I was working as a trade show manager for eBay. It was one of the best times of my life. I was working for a great company that was doing amazing work, empowering people to become entrepreneurs. And this was way before the days of Amazon and e-commerce, as you'll remember. And so I got to travel around the country and do trade shows for eBay. And I did this for a number of years until there was a point where I felt like, it's time for me to step into a higher position and really step into my leadership. And so luckily, my boss, she ended up sort of deciding to leave the company, and there was a role that became available, which was her position. It was a much more senior role. And since I hadn't really been identified for a promotion, I thought, well, maybe this will be an opportunity for me to finally advance. And so I sort of raised my hand and volunteered to take her position. And they said, sure, why not? We'd love to give you this role. So I thought, okay, great. So this is finally my opportunity to step into a bigger leadership role, which I did. But that role actually entailed for me to do something that I had never done before, which was to organize and lead a 10,000 person conference called eBay Live. It was our big user conference for eBay, a very high profile event. And I thought, this would be a great opportunity for me, but at the same time, I was stepping into some really big shoes. So I remember at that point in time kind of thinking about what type of leader did I want to be? Like, what kind of leadership style did I want to embrace? And at that point in my life, I was still, a young manager, hadn't, had a ton of role models around me that I would have, said that I look up to. The only leadership style that I had really been exposed to was my boss, who had just left the company. And I would describe her as much more of a micromanager, loved to be in the weeds, loved to have a lot of the control in her hands. And when I sort of looked at that leadership style, I thought, that's not something that I really resonate with. I don't see myself working in that way. So I'll never forget on the first day of my big leadership, my big task force meeting, with all the sort of executives that were there on my team, I remember walking in and I said to them, listen, I have this vision that I want eBay Live to be the best organized and best attended conference in our company's history. That's my big vision. But I have something to admit. I've actually never done anything like this before, and I need your help. Now, in that moment, two things could have happened, right? They could have just basically said, here's the door, and escorted me out. Here's this person who doesn't know what she's doing. We'll find someone more experienced. But that actually didn't happen, luckily for me. What did end up happening is people started raising their hand one by one and saying, here's how I can help. And here's how I see how this should be. They had been in those roles before and had a lot more experience than I. And by me sort of being vulnerable in that moment and asking for help, it really invited them to be able to come in, step in, be empowered to take on that ownership. And what ended up happening is that we created a super collaborative team. I stepped out of the details and allowed people to really take ownership and authority over their areas. And they came to each meeting subsequently after that fully prepared to collaborate and to give 150%. Now, what ended up happening is that we did achieve our goal. We did organize one of the best attended eBay Lives in our company's 10-year history. But the point is that I learned something really important in that experience, which is, as women, we have options. We have alternatives in the way we can lead. A lot of times we feel like we have to emulate the traditional, or what I call the more masculine style of leadership that we see kind of role modeled around us. And what I found through that experience is that that's not necessarily the only way to lead. There are other ways to lead that are much more collaborative and inclusive. And for me, that felt much more authentic and natural. And so what I ended up doing a few years later is leaving eBay and changing careers completely because I wanted to support women in developing a more authentic leadership approach and leadership style based on the things that I had learned, based on the things that I had experienced as a leader, especially in a male-dominated field like tech. So what ended up happening is I designed something called the feminine leadership model, which kind of combines both masculine and also feminine traits of leadership. And now when I say those words, you might, get triggered, or you might think of gender when I speak about those qualities, but I kind of want to invite you to think about them as just personality traits, characteristics that both men and women hold within themselves. We all have both masculine and feminine qualities. And so just want to kind of invite you to think about it that way and think about how you tend to show up in your leadership approach, and how you can perhaps find that balance within yourself. So today I want to talk quickly about one of the big leadership challenges that women face. Now, we all know what those challenges are. I don't have time today to go into all of them, but I do want to talk about one of them. And that one is the one where we tend to have to choose between all the confusing messages that we are told. Women are told that they have to be assertive, but not too assertive, because then you might be seen as aggressive or too dominating, or another word that I won't even mention today. We're told that we need to be less emotional, but we need to be direct. We need to be, good good decision makers, and all of these kind of things. And so we're always sort of given these confusing messages on how to behave and how to show up, especially in the workplace. And so what we end up having to do is having to choose between being respected and seen as an authority in our field versus being liked. And there's always this sort of tug of war that goes on for women, which leads to something called the double bind. So the double bind is the confusing messages that women are always sent, which makes it very difficult for us to choose an effective leadership style. And a lot of times we're labeled, we're kind of stuck in either the aggressive box or the difficult to work with box. And once we're labeled those things, it's really hard to get out of that, get out of those labels, right? And so having to choose between respected versus being liked. I'm going to talk a little bit more in just a second around what those two sort of dichotomies or two ends of that spectrum look like today, to really get a sense of how that can impact our leadership effectiveness. So what ends up happening is that if we're on one side of that leadership tightrope, we might get stuck with the office housework and not get higher visibility projects. If we're on the other side of that leadership tightrope, people may not really like us and may not want to really work with us, right? So this is kind of the big leadership challenge that women are faced with that cause this double bind. Now, if we're on the too feminine side of that leadership tightrope, we might get labeled the nice girl. And if you're in that nice girl box, you might get stuck with all of the planning of all of the events, for instance, or you might be given all the administrative work to do, or some of the, kind of less visible, less important work to do. Now, do people like you? Absolutely. Right? Because they know that they can count on you, that you will always say yes, and you will find a way to make it happen. Sort of like the Anne Hathaway character in The Devil Wears Prada. If you remember that movie, you'll remember her character. She was the yes girl. She did everything she could to please her boss. But at the end of the day, did people take her seriously? Did people see her as leadership material? Absolutely not. So one of the big pitfalls that might happen is if we get stuck in the nice girl box, we may not be able to take on the projects and take on the assignments that actually help us get seen and help us get promoted. Now, if we're on the other side of that leadership tightrope, we might be labeled the ice queen. So this is when we're on the too masculine side of that leadership tightrope. Now, if you remember in the movie, the Meryl Streep character is your typical ice queen, very cold, unemotional. Nobody really likes her, but at the same time, people see her as an authority in her field. She's very respected. Now, the problem with that is that if you're leading from that place of being too masculine or being the ice queen, the danger is that people may not really feel comfortable around you. They might not be open to sharing things with you. If there's a fire, you may not end up hearing about it because people are afraid that you might, yell at them or they might get in trouble. And so there's definitely drawbacks of being that typical ice queen that also doesn't really kind of help our case for advancement. So you're damned if you do, damned if you don't. At the end of the day, we end up wearing masks, right, to be able to sort of navigate that leadership tightrope. And at some point, we sort of hide a certain aspect of our personality to be able to do that, which is really exhausting, having to sort of wear that mask and pretend to be someone that you're not and not be authentic. And that can lead to either checking out, opting out, or burning out. So when I speak to women and women come to me for coaching, a lot of times they're in one of those buckets. They're either, looking for their next opportunity because they don't feel valued, they don't feel like they're being impactful, or they're sort of looking for their next opportunity, like to get out of the corporate world and out of, especially in the tech space, go into consulting or starting a business, just not wanting to deal with it at all. Or worse yet, which is something I've dealt with in my career, is burning out, right? Just being so exhausted from having to figure out how to navigate this tightrope that you just burn out and you're not able to work at all. You're actually just useless to the world, which is not obviously desirable. So either way, these are kind of the three buckets that we end up finding ourselves in, which does not help our case for advancement and closing that leadership gap that we're all really interested in doing. So I just want to invite you to reflect on your own career and ask yourself, and maybe if you're comfortable sharing, type it in the chat box, any challenges you've experienced on that leadership tightrope, any times or any points in your career where you felt like you had to be the nice girl, and how did that impact you? Or where you might have, swayed to the other side of that spectrum, where you were the ice queen, and how did that affect you, or your effectiveness as a leader? So if you want to share, I'll invite you to share some of your comments in the chat box. So what do we do about this, right? Like, what's the antidote? And for me, what I experienced in my own leadership journey really informed kind of my ideas around finding that balance. How do we actually stand in the middle of that tightrope instead of having to choose between, the nice girl side or the ice queen side? And what ended up happening is I developed this leadership model, which I call the feminine leadership model, which is really a roadmap that combines women's strengths, the things that are unique to women that really are things that we kind of bring to the table. And we combine those with traditional qualities of leadership, the qualities that we know that we need to get ahead and to succeed. So if you look at this model, it's made up of 7 feminine strengths, which are on the outside sort of red petals of this circle, which are vision, vulnerability, care, intuition, empathy, collaboration, and humility. And then the 4 masculine traits, which are in the middle of the circle, which are being assertive, daring, resilient, and decisive. And in the middle of the model, the word centered, that I'm going to talk to you a little bit about so you understand why that's there. So this in its totality is the feminine leadership model. And it's a situational leadership model. It's not something that we say that you have to do all of it all at the same time, but it's an invitation for you to be able to pick and choose the qualities that you need in any given situation. So let's say you're in, a brainstorming where you're trying to kind of iterate and come up with some really good ideas with your team. Those are the opportunities where you might want to step into vulnerability, to not knowing, asking for other people's input. Maybe you want to be humble and not give all the answers and not give all the direction. Maybe you want to express your vision, and allow people to really know kind of where you're coming from. And in other cases, let's say there's a tight deadline and you need to, get something done. You may want to be a little bit more assertive. You may want to be more decisive around how you delegate things and how you communicate those things. So it really just depends on what the situation requires. But at the end of the day, we want to be able to sort of exercise both sides of that leadership tightrope in order to have an impact. So I'm going to share with you some just really quick practical applications of this, depending on where you fall on that leadership tightrope, so that you can find more balance and be more impactful. So if you find yourself on that too feminine side of the spectrum, and you're on that nice girl box, here are a couple of tips. Now, I shared with you that whole idea of being centered. Like, what do I mean by that, right? What does that actually mean? So if any of you have ever taken a yoga class or a meditation class, you know what it feels like to be centered. It's when you feel calm, relaxed, really grounded. And when we're able to be centered, we're able to speak with more authority. So a lot of the times when we're on that too feminine, the nice girl side of that leadership tightrope, we tend to speak with upspeak. We may say something like, is it okay if I just ask a question? Right? Asking for permission to speak. Or we might say something like, I think we need to go to the board of directors and ask for more money, where we sort of give an inflection with our voice, and that conveys that we're not actually confident in what we're saying. So in order to correct for that, I share in my book something called the centering exercise, which is a really quick 30-second centering exercise that helps us get grounded and get more calm and relaxed to then be able to speak directly and with confidence. So I don't have time to lead you in that exercise today, but whatever exercise that feels comfortable to you, some of you might already have something that you use in your everyday life, could be breathing exercises, could be quick visualization, to help us really get calm and centered so that we can speak with more authority. And that helps us have a better impact in terms of getting out of that nice girl box. When we are grounded and centered, and when we're able to sort of put boundaries in place, we're then able to sort of say no, right? We're a lot of times when we're in the nice girl end of that spectrum, we are very accommodating, and we want to say yes to everything, and we want to be liked by everybody. But by doing so, we kind of take on extra work that's not as impactful. So when we're able to put those boundaries in place, we can seek out higher visibility projects. We can go to our managers and say, listen, I want to take on some stretch assignments. I feel like I'm ready to get to the next level. I want a challenge. Is there something that you see for me that I can do that can help me, master those skills? Or if there is a higher visibility project that you know of, maybe you can ask your manager to consider you for that. So putting those boundaries in place, saying no, of course, politely and with tact, and making sure that you're giving yourself the room and the space to take on those higher stretch assignments is going to position you at the time when it comes to think about who they're promoting and who they want to advance. And of course, being confident, trusting yourself and your intuition is another very important piece to this. So in the feminine leadership model, intuition is one of the big qualities. And a lot of times women are highly intuitive. We just don't trust ourselves. We just don't trust ourselves to make those decisions or to speak with authority or to even go for those opportunities when they present themselves. And so a fun exercise that I like to lead people in is the power poses exercise. You may be familiar with Amy Cuddy's work. If you haven't, I highly recommend her TED Talk on power poses. It's amazing. And so doing the power pose, the superwoman pose, or any kind of pose where you're taking up more space, actually releases the chemicals that give us superhuman strength that tends to feel like confidence. So those are some kind of quick and dirty tips on how to just really quickly change your posture, change your body language to assume more confidence. So when we are presenting, or we're in a conversation, or we're in a meeting, we're able to articulate ourselves in an impactful way. I have a ton of other exercises and tools that I mentioned in my book, Leading Gracefully, that I work with all my clients around, because self-confidence really is the foundation to be able to be an effective leader. So really quickly, some things to deal with the ice queen side of that leadership tightrope. Vulnerability, we've all heard about it from Brene Brown, can be used as a strength. They say vulnerability is the birthplace of innovation, creativity, and change. And I wholeheartedly agree with that statement. As I shared with you in my opening, this was what allowed me to really establish trust with my team. And that authenticity by being vulnerable and saying, you know what, I just don't know how to do this and I need your help, can really establish that trust that's necessary to be able to get the job done and work collaboratively. So I invite you to think about vulnerability as a strength and not a weakness, and ask yourself, where can I be more vulnerable? Where are the areas where I can maybe take a step back and allow others to step in? The other one is empathy. So, you know, all this requires of us is to be able to step in the shoes of someone else, right? To see things from another person's perspective. So a lot of times we, you know, have an assumption about how somebody feels or where they're coming from. But by communicating with empathy, telling people how you feel, explaining why you feel that way, and then doing the same and asking the same of the other person can really help open up dialogue and help us understand where other people are coming from. And again, this establishes trust. It establishes a foundation for a better working relationship. And we can be much more effective when we're practicing empathy versus just assuming what we think what other people are going through, or assuming we know what the other person is thinking. And I have some great exercises in my book that you can check out to be able to acquire that skill set. And finally, staying humble. A lot of times women have a hard time with tooting their own horn. And if you're on the ice queen side of the spectrum, maybe you're tooting your own horn too much and not giving people credit. So this is really about finding that balance, depending on where you are on that leadership tightrope. If you're not humble enough, you know, you may want to find authentic ways that feel comfortable for you to be able to give credit to others, and also, you know, promote yourself and promote the things that you're doing along with your team. If you're taking all the credit and not allowing other people to shine, you may want to think about that and find ways to make sure that people are recognized and feel valued for their contributions. So finding that balance on that on the humility scale is really important as well. So as we close today, I want to ask you to reflect on what type of leader do you want to be? Do you want to be on that, you know, on the ice queen side of the spectrum, or do you want to be the nice girl, or really do you want to be somewhere in between? And so we can reflect on the feminine leadership model, and I'll leave you with this question of which leadership capacity will help you practice, will help you be a more effective leader, so that if you practice that skill, that leadership capacity, it'll help you become a more effective leader. So for some of you, for others, it might be empathy or intuition. So I invite you to think about just one or two of these capacities and maybe write them down as a commitment that you're going to work on after today's session, that you might try to practice for the next, let's say, 3 months, just to be able to cultivate that behavior and leadership capacity. And with that, I'll just invite you to connect with me. I have a lot more information, happy to share with you, happy to offer you a free 30-minute career strategy session. If you're interested in learning more about the feminine leadership model, you can read about it in Leading Gracefully. It's available on Amazon. And I have a new course on building self-confidence. That's a self-study online course called Beat the Inner Bully and Build Self-Confidence. So I'll invite you to just check that out if that's something that you're interested in. And I really appreciate your time and hope that today's session was valuable to you, and looking forward to hearing more from all of you very soon. Thanks very much.